y'all, and welcome back to another episode of the Renaissance Room podcast. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about being in your power as an African American and being in predominantly white spaces and not cowering. And I do believe that this is actually a superpower. Like, I think it takes a lot of time to get here. And first off, I want to kind of start by sharing how I got here. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this dynamic of being the only Black person or a few, African Americans in predominantly white spaces. So first and foremost, I always knew that I wanted to be someone who was cultured. When I was 12, I traveled to DC for the very first time. And I'm from a small town in Ohio, right? Midwest, up north, very racist, very Republican. And so when I went to DC, it literally changed my life. You know what I mean? I saw for the first time African Americans who were successful, who were thriving. When I got a little bit older, I think I went to Atlanta when I was like 20. I went to Atlanta when I was like 20. And even though it wasn't my style, it was very flashy, and I still don't really like Atlanta to this day. But I was like, wow, you know what I mean? So one, I do believe in the importance of traveling. I do believe in that. And especially if you're African American, I believe in visiting towns and cities and states where there is really deep and rich culture, right? Because when you get up north, many of us have migrated, we're not as unified. We don't really know who we are. You know what I mean? We've been in these very progressive states and cities. And so we've kind of been ushered into what we now have today, which is multiculturalism, right? And they don't really deal with issues like racism. They don't want to really sit with the grotesque history that is American society and African American history and so forth. And so that's why you'll kind of see many people, many immigrants, even in this space, right? Pick up on Black oppression and kind of wear it as a dress, you know what I mean? Taking it on and off when it's convenient for them. But outside of, their own convenience, they don't acknowledge African American, our plight, right? And so I think it's so important to travel down south where the roots are rich. You know what I mean? You have Black people down there who know who they are and they know what happened. You know what I mean? They're not struggling with some of the issues that a lot of African Americans up north are struggling with. And I think even in that, that could be a whole book. You know what I mean? But I think that will require a lot of research. But that's just an idea. You know what I mean? If I had the time, that's something I would definitely write because that's real. You know what I mean? We struggle with so much. It's such an identity crisis up here because we've had to integrate so much so with white Americans that it required assimilation and it required a little bit of our erasure, right? And so in the South, there was a lot more unification, right? There were more African Americans in that space. And so there was more resistance to, you know what I mean, to kind of assimilate and so forth. And obviously there's strength in numbers. And so it's important to travel. Seriously, it's important to travel. It's important to expand your horizon. And most importantly, undo so many of the narratives that have been passed on to you as an African American, because much of it is stereotypical and it's incredibly harmful to your self-esteem, right? Most people up north are, especially in my town, they're living under this radar and under this weight of everything that they're really not. You know what I mean? They're living out so many lies, you know what I mean, about who they are. And, for me, how I arrived at this place is, yes, through travel, holding on to those early experiences, like I mentioned with DC, but most importantly, doing my own independent study, and I don't really know where it started for me. I try to go back and think, what was it? I know when I was in the 5th grade, I read The Coldest Winter Ever. I know that was not appropriate. That was not an age appropriate read. But, my mom had this bookshelf and it was all these urban fiction books. And so I think there was kind of a bit of a sense of appreciation for African American life. I think one thing I loved about it, and how it was depicted was just how real, how raw, how strong, how sensual, how in control. You know what I mean? I just think there was really something in reading those urban fiction tales at such a young age that really just kind of controlled the narrative. And I think it was the first time in my life where there was this introduction to African American literature, and it wasn't coming from this disempowering place, And so I really enjoyed that. And I also loved the escapism of it as well. So there was a little bit of that in my origin story, but I do remember meeting with a Black-owned bookstore owner. It was, and that bookstore is actually now closed. She was essentially bought out. The Koreans had moved next door, yes, and they opened up a they opened up a bookstore, and she talked about how this is what happens, right? She said that, when there's a black owned business, she said typically immigrants or, white Americans will come and essentially buy out the black owned bookstore. And so that's essentially what happened. She was essentially priced out of that location, and that bookstore is no longer existent, but I was able to sit with her. And I remember walking in there often, we would have conversations, and she just told me like, there's so much I had to learn. And she told me to keep reading and keep going. And so I absolutely, appreciate that experience. It was so real. I wish I would got a photo with her. I'm not sure if she's still with us today, but God bless her. She's amazing. And that was another turning point in my life. And so I think just ultimately I had reached a point where I had enough racist experiences, and my father instilled such a sense of confidence within me that I wasn't really taking up all of that. Like, I got to a point where, past adolescence, in my young adult years, where I was like, listen, you know what I mean? I'm not about to keep taking this racist stuff off these white people. You know what I mean? Like, what's up with this? You know what I mean? And so that curiosity kind of led me to understand the ways of the world and what's true and what's false and why they do what they do. You know what I mean? Why are they so nasty towards us? Right. And so fast forward, here we are today, and I can walk into a white space and I can stand very tall. I do believe in the quote that Maya Angelou says, where she says, walk into a room and you're standing as 10,000, right? And I know that's so profound, and you're like, man, what does that mean? And like, for me, the way that I interpret that is like, you have to understand like everybody in your generation that got you to where you are, right? Your ancestors, that's real. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I think about, my grandmothers who were writers, who were seamstress, right? In a very different time where there was no such thing as like coming online and, creating an Instagram page and starting a business. You know what I mean? Like, there was real trials, and there was real struggles and discrimination that made those dreams impossible. You know what I mean? That made it very difficult for those dreams to come into fruition, right? You think about the prayers that our ancestors prayed, even when you're talking about being enslaved, even when you talk about, Jim Crow, even when you talk about, through the civil rights, just how, they were praying for the freedom that we have today. And so it's like, when you walk into a room, just know that this has been a very long journey. You know what I mean? I know we look at history, and, this is the thing I hate about American society. But you talk about institutionalized learning, the ways in which we're taught, especially as African Americans, like, and even from a historical context, we're taught that it was something that happened outside of ourselves, that we're not a part of that history. And that's not true. You know what I mean? So as I said, like, you're standing as 10,000. It took a very long journey for you to get to be where you are. And so for you to be an African American and walk into a particular type of room, just know that was a lot of answered prayers. That was a lot of hard work. You know what I mean? And it just finally came to pass, 20 something generations later. And that's starting with you. So it's like, that's kind of how I see that. And so when I walk into a room, it's like, man, we made it. You know what I mean? I remember I did my first internship for the city's local magazine. I said, wow. And, the white people were in there. It was so white and uncultured and just completely whack, if I'm being honest. But I remember sitting at the coffee table, and I'm like, man, like, I'm sitting up here in this magazine, like, we did this, you know what I mean? And I just had a moment where I just kind of acknowledged the fact that, like, man, I'm sure there's so many of my ancestors who wanted to be here, right? Who maybe didn't have a family, you know what I mean? A mother, a father, right? Crack epidemic, like, crack era, like, just so many different things that have taken place within our community that have hindered us from really moving onward and building wealth and having these experiences that we sometimes take for granted for today. You know what I mean? So that's kind of how I see it. And that's what I think you should carry with you first and foremost. But second of all, when you start to develop your own sense of self-esteem, meaning you are a person of integrity, that's what I've been reading, right? It's been taking me a minute to get through. As you guys know, I'm moving through life's transitions. Okay. It's bell hooks. It's Rock My Soul. It's Black People in Self-Esteem. And it's a really, really profound book. She references Nathaniel Brandon or something. I think this was 6 pillars of self-esteem a lot in the book. And one of the pillars is being a person of integrity, right? So she talked about exploring integrity in terms of African Americans and just how, there was a point in time where for many of us, we were sort of at a place of polarity, right? In regards to our self-esteem, because, it was like, okay, we don't have money in the house, right? We don't have groceries in the house. But your son is out and he's slinging dope. You know what I mean? What do we do in this situation? Right. For example, it's like, okay, I don't have these certain requirements, but I need this job. So I may lie on the resume. So she talks about how America has really required a lot of African Americans to sort of compromise their sense of integrity for survival. And so that's kind of like one of the reasons why we don't have self-esteem is because we're not able to really live in a way that's upright and honest. Now, fast forward, here we are today. Prayerfully, most people under the sound of my voice, I don't think that's your story and that's your situation. So, you want to be a person of integrity. You want to do what it is that you say you're going to do. You want your word to be clean. Okay. And you want to try to do the right thing, even when no one is looking. So that's one aspect of it. And so when I think about just doing things that make you feel good, I remember when I first dropped out of college, back in 2018, I said, I don't want to be unintelligent, and so my goal was to read books. I literally remember having sticky notes up on my bedroom wall of like words. And I think one of them was acumen, and I was serious about that. I was serious about not being perceived as uneducated because at that time, college was a big thing. You would go to an employer, and tell them that you wasn't in school and they were automatically considering you to be a statistic. You know what I mean? You would tell white people, whether it was on the job or interview or whatever, yeah, I'm in school, and their eyes would light up. They would have a completely different regard, for you. So I just feel like at the end of the day, that was a big thing. And so I was afraid of being perceived as unintelligent. And so I really just started to hit the books. And it started off with a little bit more lighter content, like things like, positive thinking books and like self-help and all of that stuff. And so that was a little bit of my foundation. But fast forward, here we are today, and I'm into nonfiction. That's mostly what I read. I mean, it's kind of what I've always read, but like that's mostly what I read now. And I'm all about becoming a better person. And so when you get it out the mud, when you stand in your truth, when you stand in the fact of, where you've been, where your family has been, where you're going, you can just stand with 10 toes. You know what I mean? And so when white people try to do this thing of like using you, getting over on you and disregarding you, you can call it out. Quite frankly, I'm at a point in my life where when we talk about being confrontational, I think we see it as this thing of aggression, but confrontation doesn't have to be aggression, but confrontation can absolutely be a thing. Well, let's have a conversation. You know what I mean? Because I'm at a point in my life where I don't do disrespect. You know what I mean? I just don't. Like, I don't go in spaces where I'm not respected. I'm not, vying to be at anybody's table. I'm taking my time with it. You know what I mean? I trust in what I'm building. I trust in what God has for me. And I just trust that that's not going to come through, you know what I mean? Me being out here pandering or feeling like I got to beg somebody to sit at their table. And, one of the things about white supremacy is that it's never critiqued. White Americans never have to stop and be like, okay, why did you do that? Why did you say that to that black woman? You know what I mean? Why did you do that to that black man? Like, that's one of the fallacies. Their behavior is never critiqued. And so you have to understand racism, discrimination, and microaggressions have not gone away, right? It's just a new form. So that's the thing about it. Every so years, the advocacy is ongoing. The plight is continuous because racism just reforms, right? It rebrands itself. Okay. And so that's why I was like, well, listen, hold up. You know what I mean? I know y'all trying to get on trying to get on the plight of African Americans as migrant groups, but it's like, you're not an African American and that's not your story. You know what I mean? You have a completely different story. You are talking about fleeing to a country for opportunity. That was not our story. We didn't come here looking for opportunity. You see what I'm saying? So yeah, you may be oppressed in here and you may have, you may experience discrimination, but that doesn't make you an African American, and it doesn't make your story align with our story and our plight and our journey. And I have a problem with that because I feel like at the end of the day, when it's African Americans, there's nobody on the front lines. Hispanic communities, migrant communities, Latino communities are not on the front lines for us. You know what I mean? So I have a problem with people using Black people to coddle and to comfort their own, experiences within American society. And a lot of people have done that. That's one of the hallmarks of white supremacy, right? We nurse their babies. You see what I'm saying? So I just feel like at the end of the day, you think that you're being an ally by saying, hey, listen, African Americans, Black people, straight up, we have the same story. Look, we have the same oppression. No, you're not. You're playing into white supremacy. That's what they do. You see what I'm saying? When you say, hey, Black people come to my rescue, that's what they do. You see what I'm saying? So you're not really being an ally. Being an ally is showing up when it's not convenient. Our struggle is not convenient. You don't just put it on and take it off. We still dealing with racism to this day. White Americans have never really checked their ideologies and shifted their paradigms about African Americans. You know what I mean? Like, even though conversations today are a little bit more taboo, they're a little bit more taboo because progressives are kind of leading the way in terms of media, and liberalism is kind of the space in which, the society wants to navigate, you know what I mean? And rather, position itself, mostly because it feels good to be a liberal, to be an all for all, you know what I mean? Versus to sit with the reality that we ain't all for all, and that some of us are being discriminated against, and some of us are still fighting this plight to be accepted. You see what I'm saying? That's hard to sit with when it's been over 400 years. You know what I mean? That's hard to say, well, damn, we really ain't making no progress like that. You know what I mean? So it's easier to be like, well, listen, we're all getting along. We're all being friends, and so that's just the thing. And when most persons are, living in and occupying some of the most progressive states, you're talking California, you're talking about New York, then of course those narratives are going to dominate our landscape. But at the end of the day, we ain't progressing. We're not progressing. It's just getting a new name and it's getting rebranded. And y'all need to stop trying to take hold of Black people's struggle. So anyway, you got to walk into rooms and just know that it took a while for you to get there. You know what I mean? You got to know who you are. That doesn't mean you got to be loud. You don't even got to say anything. So much of confidence. This is something I will say to people, and when you're struggling and you're learning yourself as African American, you're building your confidence. Sometimes you kind of swing on the pendulum of being like, a little bit more flamboyant. And that's not even just Black. That's just anybody who's struggling with low self-esteem. You know what I mean? At first you kind of are a little bit more loud, maybe a little bit more arrogant. And then you might be a little too humble, a little too modest. But eventually you find your balance and you find your footing in your middle ground. And so I just want to say that confidence isn't loud. You don't have to walk in like, look at me, I know I'm it. No, it's silent. It's, hey, listen, I'm here. You're doing that little thing that you do. You're trying to undermine, and I'm about to play you like you stupid. You know what I mean? Because I'm going to respond very intelligently, and I'm going to do it with so much grace, so much poise, so much elegance. You know what I mean? That you're going to be sitting there like, oh, wow. Maybe not all Black people. You know what I mean? Like looking stupid. You know what I mean? Because really what racism is ignorance. And I think if we would really call it that, more people would be a little bit more ashamed to be racist. You know what I mean? Like we look at race as like this powerful hate train, when the reality is that racism is so ignorant. You are someone who is not cultured. You've never left your hometown. You know what I mean? Like, we don't talk about white supremacy in that regard. We don't create shame around it in that regard. You know what I mean? And that's just because of the lack of scholars and persons who've been privy to white Americans' lifestyles. You know what I mean? And races and things like that. And so you got to stop looking at that stuff like it's empowering. You're very ignorant. Like, seriously. You know what I mean? You're like third grade. Like, come on. You know what I mean? So I'm going to go ahead and end there. But I hope that this encourages you, and I hope that this empowers you, and I hope that you know that at the end of the day, this is your plight, your journey, your family, your lineage, and the work that you and God are doing to bring about change in this world. If you're there, it's because you deserve to be there. You deserve to be there because, trust, ain't nobody giving you no handouts. Now, know that first and foremost. So let's take a step back. You know what I mean? Let's take a step back. Let's stand a little tall. Let's perk up our shoulders. Let's keep that chin high, because you're not here on anybody's resume. You're not here because you're a relative to such and such and someone gave you a referral. Absolutely not. You're here because you worked very hard to get to where you are. And so own that. Be it, own it. And, when things get a little overwhelming, take a step back. But most and foremost, always be confrontational. Always be confident. Do not let people treat you any kind of way. And listen, with confrontation, I understand sometimes, things can get a little murky. That's an art in itself. Read a couple books on how to confront people, how to, assert yourself in a way without, being a bit argumentative or aggressive. You got to learn how to play the game. But at the end of the day, what I'm not saying is sit there and be silent. Don't take that. Do not take that. You got to stick up for yourself. You have to let people know you're not to be messed with. And as my grandmother say back in the day, they're not your friends. Don't get up in that job and up in them spaces telling everybody all your business. Learn to keep your mouth closed. You'll have a little less problems. Do your job, get in, get out, and go about your day. Okay? So I like to think that, the world is progressing. I would love to be in spaces where there's, diversity and it's really embraced and it's not something that we're just wearing for flattery. But I also know that, we're just living in a day and age where, we're not progressing as much. So it's more like an aesthetic more than anything. Peace.